In the early morning hours of August 23, 2003, in Park County, Montana, 14 men would be found dead, all killed within 72 hours, all poisoned with ricin extracted from castor beans, all executives of Titan AgriCorp, the largest agricultural conglomeration in the Northern Rockies. The FBI would take 4 days to connect the deaths, but in the ranching communities along Highway 89, everyone already knew. Someone had declared war on the corporation. And the reason wasn't over politics, wasn't over environmental regulations, wasn't over union disputes. It was over 5,400 acres of land that had belonged to one family since 1887, over 340 head of cattle, poisoned by contaminated water, over a 64-year-old man who died of a heart attack during a legal deposition, and over a 58-year-old widow who had never broken a law in her life until the courts showed her that justice was a luxury only corporations could afford. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The story you're about to hear doesn't glorify revenge. It shows you what happens when justice fails and desperation takes its place. Before we begin, tell us what country and city you're listening from. We want to know how far these stories from Forgotten America reach, and at what time of day violence finds you through this screen. August 2003, Park County, Montana. A place where the Absaroka Range meets the Yellowstone River, where summer temperatures could reach 91 degrees during the day and drop to 52 degrees at night, and where the nearest hospital was 43 miles away in Livingston. A place where ranchers still measured success in generations rather than quarterly earnings, where a handshake meant more than a contract, and where taking a family's land was considered worse than murder because it killed not just the present, but the past and future too. The air in Montana that summer smelled like lodgepole pine from the forests, like sage and wild grass from the meadows, like the mineral-rich water of the Yellowstone River, and when the wind came from the south, like sulfur from the thermal features in Yellowstone National Park, 62 miles away. The soundscape was the wind, always the wind, whistling through the valleys, the distant bugle of elk in the high country, the splash of trout rising in the river, the rumble of pickup trucks on gravel roads, and on clear nights, absolute silence broken only by the howl of wolves that had been reintroduced to the ecosystem in 1995 and were still learning to coexist with livestock. The Henderson Ranch sat 31 miles south of Livingston, accessible only by County Road 540, a 2-lane gravel road that turned to mud in spring and was impassable in winter. 5,400 acres of prime grazing land, river-bottom hayfields, and high-country summer range that stretched from the valley floor at 5,200 feet elevation up to timberline at 8,900 feet. Not the biggest ranch in Park County, not the wealthiest, but Henderson land. 4 generations of Henderson blood had worked that ground since 1887, when Samuel Henderson had claimed it with a homestead patent, a team of oxen, and the stubborn determination that would define his descendants for 116 years. In August 2003, the landscape was greens and golds, the hayfields ready for second cutting, the native grasses still thick despite the drought that had plagued Montana for 3 years. The Absaroka Mountains rose like a wall to the east, still snow-capped on the highest peaks even in August, their granite faces glowing pink in the alpenglow of sunset. The ranch buildings clustered near the river, the original log homestead built in 1887, a barn from 1923 that could hold 80 tons of hay, a newer metal equipment shed from 1989, and scattered outbuildings that told the ranch's history in wood and corrugated steel. Cottonwood trees lined the river, their leaves turning that particular shade of yellow-green that meant fall was coming. The wind carried the smell of fresh-cut hay, the sound of irrigation water running through ditches, and the constant presence of the Yellowstone River, running clear and cold, the lifeblood of the ranch. Margaret Rose Henderson was 58 years old in August 2003. She stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighed 162 pounds, most of it muscle from a lifetime of ranch work that didn't stop just because you were a woman. Her hands were weathered and strong, with calluses from handling hay bales and fence wire, with scars from barbed wire cuts and rope burns, with fingers that had pulled calves and mended tack and done 10,000 other tasks that ranching required. Her face was tanned and lined, with crow's feet from squinting into the Montana sun, with deep vertical lines between her eyebrows from 58 years of concentration and worry. She had a scar on her left cheek from a horse that had thrown her when she was 16, another on her right hand from a knife that had slipped while she was cutting baling twine. Her hair was gray, cut short because long hair was impractical when you worked outside, and she wore it in a style that required nothing more than shampoo and a comb. She walked with a slight stoop in her shoulders, not from age but from decades of physical labor that compressed the spine and wore down the joints. Margaret woke every morning at 5:17 a.m., had done so for 40 years, since she'd married Robert Henderson in 1963, and moved to the ranch as an 18-year-old bride. She'd make coffee in an old percolator, the same one her mother-in-law had used, the kind that made coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and she'd drink it black with no sugar while standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the Absarokas. Her breakfast was simple: oatmeal with raisins, a piece of toast with homemade chokecherry jam, and a second cup of coffee. She'd eat quickly, efficiently, the way ranchers ate, treating food as fuel rather than pleasure. By 6:00 a.m., she'd be dressed in Wrangler jeans that had been patched twice, a long-sleeve cotton shirt even in summer because you didn't expose skin to the Montana sun if you had any sense, work boots from Ariat that cost $120 and lasted 3 years, and a straw cowboy hat that had been her husband's, the sweatband stained dark from years of wear. Margaret Henderson had not always been a widow. Robert James Henderson had died on February 18, 2003, 6 months before the events of this story, at the age of 64. Heart attack, massive and fatal, suffered while giving a deposition in a lawsuit against Titan AgriCorp. He'd been sitting in a conference room in Bozeman, had been answering questions about water contamination on the ranch, had clutched his chest, had said, "I can't breathe," and had died before the ambulance arrived. The official cause of death was acute myocardial infarction brought on by chronic stress, high blood pressure, and arterial disease. The real cause, Margaret knew, was heartbreak. Heartbreak at watching the ranch fail, at seeing their cattle die, at fighting a legal battle they couldn't win against opponents who had unlimited resources. Robert Henderson had worked that ranch for 46 years, had inherited it from his father in 1975, had built it from 4,200 acres to 5,400 acres through careful management and hard work, and it had killed him to watch it being destroyed by men in suits who'd never touched a cow in their lives. Margaret and Robert had 2 children. John Samuel Henderson, 38 years old in August 2003, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 195 pounds, had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and had spent his entire life working the ranch alongside his parents. He'd been born in the log homestead, had learned to ride before he could walk, had been branded by the ranch work, a literal brand, an accident with a hot iron when he was 12 that left the Henderson ranch mark, a backwards H in a circle, scarred into his left shoulder. John was married to Rachel Henderson, née Thompson, a schoolteacher from Livingston, and they had 2 daughters, Emma aged 9 and Sophie aged 6. John drove a 1997 Ford F-250, dark green, with 184,000 miles on the odometer, a gun rack that held a Winchester Model 70 in .270 caliber, and a bed that was always full of fencing supplies, tools, and hay bales. He woke at 5 a.m. every day, worked until dark, made $0 per hour because the ranch didn't generate enough income to pay wages, and did it anyway because it was the family business, the family legacy, the only life he'd ever known or wanted. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, 35 years old in August 2003, had left the ranch. She'd gone to Montana State University in Bozeman, had earned a degree in English literature, had married a man named David Chen who worked as an architect, and now lived in Bozeman in a subdivision house with vinyl siding and a 2-car garage. She visited the ranch once a month, brought her daughters, Lily aged 7 and Grace aged 4, to see their grandmother, felt guilty about leaving, but had never been cut out for ranch life. Sarah drove a Honda Odyssey minivan, worked as a librarian at the Bozeman Public Library, making $31,000 a year, and tried not to think about the fact that her family was losing everything while she lived comfortably in town. She was a good daughter, a good mother, a good person, but she had escaped the ranch and the life it demanded, and she carried that escape like a weight she couldn't put down. Margaret Henderson drove a 1994 Chevrolet Silverado, 2-wheel drive because 4-wheel drive cost more and she'd never needed it, red with significant rust on the wheel wells and doors, 156,000 miles on the odometer, a cracked windshield that had been cracked for 2 years, and a bench seat that still smelled faintly of Robert's aftershave, even though he'd been dead for 6 months. The truck got 16 miles per gallon, needed new brake pads, and had a radio that only worked intermittently, but it ran, and that was all that mattered. The truck bed contained a toolbox, a come-along for pulling fence posts, a chainsaw, 2 spare fence posts, and a rifle, a Remington 700 in .308 caliber that Robert had bought in 1978 and had taught Margaret to shoot with in case she ever needed to put down a suffering animal. Margaret Henderson was known in Park County as a woman who worked harder than most men, who kept her word, who paid her bills even when it hurt, and who could birth a calf, mend a fence, and bake a pie all in the same day. She'd been born in Livingston in 1945, daughter of a railroad worker and a waitress, had grown up poor but happy, had married Robert Henderson when she was 18 because she loved him and because ranch life seemed romantic before she learned it was just hard. She'd lost a pregnancy in 1966, had nearly died from complications, had been told she might not have more children, and then had given birth to John in 1965 and Sarah in 1968. She attended the community Bible church in Livingston every Sunday when road conditions allowed, sat in the fourth pew from the front on the left side, and believed in God, hard work, and the idea that if you treated people fairly, they'd treat you the same way. She was learning in the summer of 2003 that this belief was wrong. The trouble had started in March 2000, 3.5 years before the killings, when Titan AgriCorp had approached the Hendersons with an offer to purchase the ranch for $2.1 million. Titan was an agricultural conglomerate based in Omaha, Nebraska, with operations in 14 states, annual revenue of $890 million, and a business model based on consolidating small ranches into large industrial operations. They'd been buying up ranches in Montana for 5 years, had acquired 47 properties totaling 180,000 acres, and the Henderson Ranch, with its river access, hay ground, and summer range, was a piece they wanted. Robert Henderson had said no. The ranch wasn't for sale, would never be for sale, would pass to John when Robert died and to Emma and Sophie after that. The land was family, was legacy, was more important than money. Titan AgriCorp had said they understood, had said they respected his decision, and then had begun a campaign of economic warfare designed to force the Hendersons into bankruptcy and foreclosure. The first incident occurred in June 2000, when a Titan subsidiary called Mountain Plains Cattle Company began operating a feedlot operation 4 miles upstream from the Henderson Ranch. The feedlot held 2,000 head of cattle, generated approximately 31,000 pounds of manure per day, and despite state regulations requiring containment, regularly discharged contaminated runoff into the Yellowstone River during spring runoff and summer thunderstorms. By August 2000, the Henderson Ranch was experiencing problems. Their cattle, which drank from the river and from irrigation ditches that drew river water, began showing symptoms of illness: weight loss, diarrhea, lethargy, death. The ranch veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Morrison from Livingston, had tested the water and found high levels of E. coli, nitrates, and chemical residues consistent with agricultural runoff. She'd written a report documenting the contamination, had dated it August 23, 2000, and had sent copies to the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the Park County Health Department, and the Hendersons' attorney. By December 2000, the Hendersons had lost 89 head of cattle, representing approximately $142,000 in value at 2000 market prices. They'd filed a complaint with the Montana DEQ, had provided Dr. Morrison's report, had requested an investigation of the Titan feedlot. The DEQ had responded in March 2001, 5 months later, with a letter stating that they'd inspected the feedlot, had found minor violations, had issued a warning, and considered the matter closed. No fine, no requirement to fix the contamination, no compensation for the Hendersons. Robert Henderson had contacted an environmental attorney in Missoula, had paid a $10,000 retainer, had filed a lawsuit against Titan AgriCorp in May 2001, seeking $250,000 in damages for the dead cattle, the contaminated water, and the ongoing harm to the ranch's viability. Titan AgriCorp's response had been swift and overwhelming. They'd hired a law firm from Denver, Blackwood & Associates, that specialized in defending large corporations against nuisance lawsuits from small operators. They'd filed motions to dismiss, motions to move the case to federal court, motions for summary judgment. They'd demanded thousands of pages of documents from the Hendersons: tax returns, veterinary records, water tests, financial statements. They'd taken depositions that lasted days. They'd hired their own experts who claimed the contamination came from natural sources, from the Hendersons' own cattle, from anywhere except Titan's feedlot. They'd dragged the case out for 2 years, forcing the Hendersons to spend money they didn't have on attorneys, experts, and court costs. In March 2003, during a deposition in Bozeman, Robert Henderson had been questioned for 6 hours about ranch management practices, about financial decisions, about whether his own negligence had contributed to the cattle deaths. The Titan attorney, a man named Richard Blackwood, 52 years old, from Denver, with a salary of $380,000 per year plus bonuses, had asked the questions with clinical precision, had implied that Robert was a bad rancher, a poor manager, a man looking for someone else to blame for his own failures. At 3:47 p.m., Robert Henderson had clutched his chest. At 3:51 p.m., the court reporter had called 911. At 4:23 p.m., at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, Robert James Henderson was pronounced dead. The deposition had been 47 pages from completion. The lawsuit died with him. Margaret Henderson had buried her husband on February 23, 2003, in the family cemetery on the ranch, under a lodgepole pine tree next to his parents and grandparents. The funeral had been held at Community Bible Church, and 283 people had attended, which was remarkable for rural Montana where distances were vast and populations were sparse. After the funeral, Margaret had sat with her son John and her daughter Sarah and had discussed the future. The ranch was in debt, owed $47,000 in legal fees, owed $23,000 to the feed store, owed $18,000 on equipment loans. The cattle herd was down to 251 head, barely enough to be profitable. The water was still contaminated, and Titan AgriCorp, through their attorney Richard Blackwood, had sent a letter dated March 3, 2003, offering to settle the lawsuit for $150,000 in exchange for the Hendersons withdrawing all claims and signing a non-disclosure agreement preventing them from discussing the case publicly. John Henderson had wanted to fight. Sarah Henderson had wanted to take the money. Margaret Henderson had wanted her husband back. They'd voted, 2-1, to accept the settlement. They'd needed the money to keep the ranch operating, to pay the debts, to survive. On March 15, 2003, Margaret Henderson had signed the settlement agreement. The check for $150,000 minus $40,000 in attorney fees and costs had been deposited into the ranch account on March 22nd. It was, Margaret thought, the price Titan AgriCorp had put on her husband's life, $110,000 after expenses, less than Robert had earned in 3 years of work, less than the ranch had lost in contaminated water and dead cattle. But it was what the law said was fair, and Margaret Henderson, who'd believed in fairness her entire life, had signed the papers and tried to pretend it was justice. But the story didn't end there, because Titan AgriCorp wasn't satisfied with winning the lawsuit. They wanted the land. In April 2003, the First Bank of Montana, which held the Henderson Ranch mortgage, had notified Margaret that her loan was being called due. The ranch owed $380,000 on the land, had been current on payments for 15 years, but the bank had inserted a clause that allowed them to demand full payment if the ranch's financial situation deteriorated. With the cattle losses, the legal fees, and Robert's death, the bank claimed the ranch was no longer viable. They gave Margaret 90 days to pay the full amount or face foreclosure. Margaret had appealed, had shown them the settlement money, had promised to rebuild the herd, had begged for more time. The bank president, Thomas Reinhardt, 51 years old, who sat on the board of directors of a Titan subsidiary, had been sympathetic but firm. The loan was due. No extensions would be granted. On July 15, 2003, exactly 5 months after Robert's death, the Park County Sheriff had served foreclosure papers on Margaret Henderson. The ranch would be auctioned on August 25, 2003. Everything. The land, the buildings, the cattle, the equipment, 116 years of family history would be sold to the highest bidder. And everyone knew who the highest bidder would be. Titan AgriCorp had already announced through a press release that they intended to bid on the property, to incorporate it into their regional operations, to modernize and consolidate it with their other holdings. They'd been asked by a reporter from the Livingston Enterprise if they felt any responsibility for the Henderson situation, given the contamination lawsuit. Richard Blackwood, speaking for Titan, had said, "Titan AgriCorp sympathizes with Mrs. Henderson's loss, but business decisions must be based on economic realities, not sentiment. The market has determined that small-scale ranching is no longer viable in the modern agricultural economy." Margaret Henderson had read that quote in the newspaper on July 17, 2003, while sitting at her kitchen table, drinking coffee from the same cup she'd drunk coffee from for 40 years. She'd read it 3 times, had felt something break inside her, not her heart, that had broken when Robert died, but something deeper, her belief in fairness, her faith in the system, her conviction that if you worked hard and followed the rules, things would work out. She'd stood up, had walked to the gun cabinet in the living room, had taken out Robert's Remington 700, had walked to the basement where Robert had kept his reloading equipment, and had started researching. Not how to shoot. She'd been shooting since she was 12 years old. How to kill 14 people and make it look like natural causes until it was too late for anyone to stop her. The targets were obvious. The 14 men who'd destroyed her family, killed her husband, and stolen her land. Not the low-level employees, not the ranch hands, not the secretaries, the decision-makers, the executives, the lawyers, the men who'd profited from the Henderson Ranch's destruction. Margaret made a list, wrote it in a spiral notebook from the dollar store, dated August 1st, 2003, Richard Blackwood, 52, lead attorney, Blackwood & Associates, Denver, the man who'd questioned Robert until his heart stopped, Jonathan Graves, 61, CEO of Titan AgriCorp, Omaha, the man who'd signed off on the strategy to destroy the Hendersons economically, Michael Stevens, 48, CFO of Titan AgriCorp, the man who'd allocated funds for the legal battle, Patricia Morrison, 44, COO of Titan AgriCorp, the woman who'd approved the feedlot operation, David Chen, 39, VP of Acquisitions, Titan AgriCorp, the man who'd first approached the Hendersons with the purchase offer, Thomas Reinhardt, 51, President, First Bank of Montana, the man who'd called the loan, Gregory Walsh, 55, Regional Director, Titan AgriCorp Montana Operations, the man who'd overseen the feedlot, Charles Brennan, 47, environmental consultant, who'd written the report claiming the contamination was natural, Dr. Alan Pierce, 58, Titan's veterinary expert, who testified the cattle deaths were due to Henderson's poor management, William Carter, 49, Montana DEQ inspector, who'd received $15,000 from a Titan subsidiary to write a favorable inspection report, Judge Harold Mathis, 63, federal judge who'd presided over the case and ruled in Titan's favor on every motion, Kevin O'Brien, 45, attorney, Blackwood & Associates, second chair in the lawsuit, Robert Bobby Carlson, 52, vice president, Mountain Plains Cattle Company, Titan subsidiary, who'd managed the feedlot, Marcus Sullivan, 54, Titan board member, who'd personally voted to pursue foreclosure on the Henderson Ranch, 14 men, some guilty of direct actions, Blackwood questioning Robert, Reinhardt calling the loan, others guilty of complicity, voting to destroy the Hendersons, profiting from their loss, being part of a system that crushed families to increase quarterly earnings, all of them responsible, all of them would pay. Margaret Henderson was not a violent woman. She'd never hit her children, never fired a gun at anything but targets and game animals, never even raised her voice unnecessarily. She attended church, baked cookies for grandchildren, volunteered at the food bank in Livingston. But she was also a woman who'd watched her husband die, who'd watched her family's legacy being stolen, who'd tried every legal option and found them all closed. She was a woman who understood that sometimes the law protects the powerful instead of the just, and when that happens, people have to protect themselves. The planning took 3 weeks. Margaret approached it methodically, practically, the way she approached every ranch task. She researched poisons online at the Livingston Public Library, using their computers because she didn't have internet at the ranch. She learned about ricin, a toxin derived from castor beans, which could be fatal in doses as small as 500 micrograms, which was virtually undetectable in routine autopsies, which caused symptoms resembling flu or food poisoning, giving the killer time to escape before the deaths were connected. She ordered castor beans online from a gardening supply company, 5 pounds for $23.50, shipped to a P.O. box she rented in Livingston under the name Susan Miller. The beans arrived on August 4th. She began extraction that day in the ranch's unused chicken coop, following procedures she'd found in a chemistry textbook at the library. The extraction took 1 week. It was surprisingly simple for something so deadly. Crush the beans, soak in acetone, filter, evaporate, repeat. By August 11th, Margaret had approximately 12 grams of ricin powder, enough to kill 24,000 people if properly administered. She'd stored it in a small glass vial, labeled it flour in case anyone found it, and hidden it in her sewing basket in the hall closet. She'd done this work alone, in the early mornings and late evenings, while John was working the ranch and Rachel was teaching summer school. She'd told no one, not her children, not her friends, not her pastor. This was her burden, her decision, her line to cross. The targets were spread across 3 states, Montana, Nebraska, and Colorado. That presented logistical challenges. Margaret needed a delivery method that would work at distance, that wouldn't immediately point to her, that would allow her to eliminate all 14 before anyone realized they were being killed. She found her answer in the annual Titan AgriCorp Executive Conference, scheduled for August 21st, 23rd at the Yellowstone Lodge in Gardner, Montana, just 47 miles from her ranch. The conference was advertised on Titan's website, was open to all senior executives and board members, and the agenda showed a gala dinner on August 22nd. All 14 of her targets would be in one place at one time. It was almost too perfect. Margaret applied for a job. On August 12th, she'd driven to Gardner, had walked into the Yellowstone Lodge, had spoken to the catering manager, and had said she was looking for temporary work, had experience in food service, would work for minimum wage. The manager, desperate for staff during the busy tourist season, had hired her on the spot. Margaret Henderson would work the executive conference, serving food and drinks to the men who'd destroyed her family, and none of them would recognize her because wealthy executives from Omaha and Denver didn't remember the faces of the ranchers they'd crushed. On August 18th, Margaret had driven to Gardner for training. She'd learned the layout of the lodge, the kitchen, the banquet hall. She'd learned that the gala dinner would be plated service, each plate prepared individually in the kitchen, each executive having a pre-assigned seat with a name card. She'd learned that she'd be one of 12 servers, each responsible for delivering plates to specific tables. And she'd learned which table her targets would be sitting at. Table 1, the head table, where the CEO, CFO, COO, and other senior leadership always sat. Perfect. August 21st, 2003, 6 p.m. The Titan AgriCorp Executive Conference began. 200 attendees, mostly men in suits, a few women in business attire, all of them checking into the Yellowstone Lodge, all of them looking forward to 3 days of networking, presentations, and what the agenda called strategic planning for continued growth. Margaret Henderson checked in for her server shift at 4 p.m., put on the white shirt and black vest that was the server uniform, tied her hair back, and tried to remember that these people were human beings, had families, had lives, even if they'd destroyed hers. The gala dinner was scheduled for August 22nd, 7 p.m. Margaret had approximately 24 hours. At 2 a.m. on August 22nd, when her shift was over and she was supposed to drive home, Margaret had hidden in a storage closet in the lodge instead. She'd waited until 3:30 a.m. when the night staff did their rounds, had then moved quietly through the lodge to the kitchen. The kitchen was locked, but she'd stolen a key during training. Inside, she'd found the prep area for the next evening's dinner. She'd found the plates, the silverware, the name cards that would mark each executive's seat. And she'd found Table 1 settings, already arranged, the names clearly visible. Richard Blackwood, Jonathan Graves, Michael Stevens, all of them. At 4:15 a.m., Margaret Henderson had taken the small glass vial from her purse. She'd opened it carefully. Using gloves she'd taken from the kitchen, she'd divided the ricin powder into 14 portions, approximately 500 micrograms each, more than enough to kill. And then, one by one, she'd contaminated the meals. Not all the food, that would be too obvious. Just the salt, sprinkled lightly on each plate, invisible against the white plates. A tiny amount, impossible to taste, impossible to see, impossible to detect until it was far too late. She'd finished at 5:20 a.m. She'd cleaned the vial, pocketed it, removed her gloves, and left the kitchen exactly as she'd found it. Then she'd left the lodge through a service entrance, had walked to her truck parked 3 blocks away, had driven home to the ranch, had arrived at 6:35 a.m., and had gone to bed for 3 hours before John woke and asked why she wasn't up yet. August 22nd, 2003, 7 p.m. The gala dinner began. Margaret Henderson was there in her server uniform, carrying plates from the kitchen to the banquet hall, smiling politely, doing her job. She watched as Richard Blackwood sat down at table 1. Watched as Jonathan Graves, the CEO, joked with Michael Stevens, the CFO. Watched as all 14 of her targets took their assigned seats, completely unaware that they were already dead. The meal was served at 7:30 p.m. Prime rib, roasted potatoes, asparagus, dinner rolls. Everyone ate. Everyone complimented the food. Everyone laughed and talked and networked while ricin was being absorbed into their bloodstreams, while their cells were beginning to die, while the countdown to their deaths had begun. Margaret worked until 10 p.m., cleaned tables, refilled water glasses, smiled at executives who didn't see her face. Then she clocked out, drove home, and waited. Ricin takes 36 to 48 hours to kill. She'd know by August 24th if she'd gotten the dose right, if the delivery method had worked, if she'd actually done what she'd planned. And she waited for something else too, for guilt, for remorse, for the horror of what she'd done to hit her. It never came. She felt nothing but cold satisfaction. They'd killed her husband. She'd killed them. The scale was balanced. The first symptom appeared at 11:23 p.m. on August 23, 2003, approximately 28 hours after the gala dinner. Richard Blackwood, 52 years old, the attorney who'd questioned Robert Henderson until his heart stopped, woke in his room at the Yellowstone Lodge with severe nausea. He'd attributed it to too much wine at dinner, had taken Pepto-Bismol from his travel kit, and had tried to go back to sleep. By 2:47 a.m., he was vomiting uncontrollably. By 4:15 a.m., he had severe diarrhea and abdominal cramping. By 6:30 a.m., when he'd missed the morning conference session, a colleague had knocked on his door and found him on the bathroom floor, conscious but unable to stand. The colleague had called 911. Blackwood had been transported to Livingston Memorial Hospital at 7:08 a.m., admitted with suspected food poisoning, given IV fluids, and told he'd be fine in a day or two. But Richard Blackwood would not be fine, because ricin, once absorbed into the bloodstream, is unstoppable. It enters cells, inactivates ribosomes, prevents protein synthesis, and causes the cells to die. The intestinal lining dies first, causing the vomiting and diarrhea. Then the liver and kidneys begin to fail as they try to filter the toxin. Then the cardiovascular system collapses as proteins necessary for blood clotting and vessel integrity can no longer be produced. There is no antidote. There is no treatment beyond supportive care. And if the dose is high enough, death is certain, usually within 36 to 72 hours of exposure. By noon on August 23rd, 6 more executives were showing symptoms. Jonathan Graves, the CEO, had collapsed during a presentation at 10:45 a.m. Michael Stevens, the CFO, had vomited in the hallway at 11:20 a.m. Patricia Morrison, the COO, had complained of severe abdominal pain at 11:55 a.m. All of them were transported to Livingston Memorial Hospital within 2 hours. The hospital, a small 25-bed facility designed to serve a town of 7,000 people, was overwhelmed. The ER had 4 beds. 7 critical patients had arrived within 90 minutes. The on-call physician, Dr. Thomas Chen, 41 years old, who'd been practicing rural medicine for 12 years, had immediately suspected food poisoning, had contacted the Park County Health Department, had requested an investigation of the Yellowstone Lodge kitchen. By 6 p.m. on August 23rd, all 14 of Margaret Henderson's targets were hospitalized, some at Livingston Memorial, others transported to larger facilities in Bozeman and Billings, all showing the same symptoms: severe gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, rising liver enzymes, dropping blood pressure. The health department had shut down the Yellowstone Lodge kitchen at 2:30 p.m., had collected food samples, had interviewed the catering staff. They'd found nothing. No salmonella in the prime rib, no E. coli in the vegetables, no obvious source of contamination. The food samples were sent to the Montana State Lab in Helena for analysis. Results would take 48 hours. Richard Blackwood died at 3:17 a.m. on August 24th in the ICU at Livingston Memorial Hospital, 55 hours after consuming ricin-contaminated food. His kidneys had failed completely. His liver was necrotic. His blood pressure had dropped to 60/40 despite maximum vasopressor support. He'd been conscious until the end, had told his wife on the phone that he loved her, had said he didn't understand what was happening, had coded at 3:12 a.m. and could not be resuscitated. Time of death, 3:17 a.m. Cause of death, preliminary, acute multi-organ failure of unknown etiology. Jonathan Graves, CEO of Titan AgriCorp, died at 7:42 a.m. on August 24th at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. He'd been transferred there at midnight when Livingston Memorial ran out of ICU beds, had been intubated and placed on a ventilator at 4 a.m. when his breathing became labored, had gone into cardiac arrest at 7:38 a.m., had been coded for 4 minutes before being pronounced dead. His wife had been in the room. His 3 children had been flying in from Omaha but hadn't arrived yet. He died alone except for nurses and doctors who didn't know him, didn't know his family, knew only that he was a 61-year-old male in multi-organ failure, and they couldn't save him. By noon on August 24th, 4 more were dead. Michael Stevens at 8:15 a.m., Patricia Morrison at 9:33 a.m., David Chen at 10:07 a.m., Thomas Reinhardt, the bank president who'd called the Henderson Ranch loan, at 11:51 a.m. All of them had died the same way: kidneys failing, liver failing, cardiovascular collapse, death. The hospitals were in crisis. The Park County Health Department had escalated to the Montana Department of Public Health. The CDC had been notified at 10 a.m. This wasn't food poisoning. Food poisoning didn't kill healthy adults this quickly, didn't cause this specific pattern of organ failure. This was something else, something worse. The CDC's Rapid Response Team arrived at Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport at 4:37 p.m. on August 24th. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 38, an epidemiologist specializing in toxins, led the team. They'd been briefed en route, 14 patients. All attended the same dinner, all showing identical symptoms, 6 already dead. The symptom pattern suggested poisoning, but the toxin was unknown. Dr. Mitchell's first order was to collect tissue samples from the deceased for analysis. Her second order was to secure all remaining food from the gala dinner. Her third order was to interview every person who'd worked the event. Margaret Henderson had known this moment would come. She'd watched the news on August 23rd, had seen the breaking story about executives falling ill, had known it was working. She'd watched on August 24th as the death toll rose, had felt no satisfaction, no guilt, just a cold sense of completion. She'd known the investigation would eventually reach her. She'd been a server at the dinner. Her name was on the employee list. They would question her. She'd prepared for this. On August 25th at 9:15 a.m., FBI Special Agent David Torres and CDC investigator Dr. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the Henderson Ranch. They'd driven up the gravel road past the Henderson Ranch Esture 1887 sign, past the log homestead where 4 generations had lived, and had knocked on the door. Margaret had answered, wearing jeans and a work shirt, her hands dirty from morning chores. They'd identified themselves, had asked if they could come in, had sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd planned the killings, and had begun asking questions. "Mrs. Henderson, we understand you worked as a server at the Yellowstone Lodge on August 22nd. "Yes, I did. Temporary work. I needed the money. Did you notice anything unusual about the food that evening? Anything that seemed off?" "No, everything seemed normal. Did you see anyone else handling the food in an unusual way? Anyone who might have had access to the kitchen?" "No, just the regular catering staff." The questions had continued for 30 minutes. Margaret had answered calmly, truthfully when possible, lying when necessary. She'd been a rancher for 40 years. She knew how to keep her face blank, her voice steady. They'd thanked her, had left at 9:47 a.m., had driven away. Margaret had watched them go, and had known it wasn't over. They'd be back. By August 25th at 2 p.m., all 14 targets were dead. The last 4 had died within an hour of each other. Gregory Walsh at 1:08 p.m., Charles Brennan at 1:33 p.m., Dr. Alan Pierce at 1:47 p.m., and William Carter at 1:52 p.m. Judge Harold Mathis had died the previous evening at 11:23 p.m. Kevin O'Brien had died that morning at 6:41 a.m., Bobby Carlson at 8:02 a.m., Marcus Sullivan at 12:34 p.m. 14 men, all dead within 62 hours of consuming ricin, all dying the same excruciating death. The CDC had identified the toxin on August 25th at 7:30 p.m. Tissue samples from Richard Blackwood's autopsy had tested positive for ricin. Dr. Mitchell had immediately notified the FBI. This was bioterrorism, a federal crime, a potential attack that could have been much larger. The FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate had mobilized. Within 4 hours, 30 federal agents were in Montana, and the investigation had shifted from food poisoning to mass murder. The investigation focused on access. Who had access to the food before it was served? The kitchen staff, the servers, the catering manager. All 12 servers were interviewed again, this time by FBI agents trained in detecting deception. Margaret Henderson was interviewed on August 26th at 10 a.m. at the FBI's temporary command center in the Park County Sheriff's Office. The interview lasted 2 hours. She'd maintained her story. She'd worked as a server, had noticed nothing unusual, had simply been trying to make extra money. But the agents had noticed inconsistencies. She'd said she'd left the lodge at 10:15 p.m. after her shift. But another server remembered seeing Margaret's truck still in the parking lot at 10:45 p.m. Where had she been for those 30 minutes? The investigation had expanded to motive. Who had reason to want these specific 14 men dead? The FBI had pulled the guest list, had cross-referenced the victims, had identified the common thread. All were connected to Titan AgriCorp. All had attended the conference. But who would target Titan executives specifically? They'd looked at environmental activists, animal rights groups, anti-corporate extremists. No leads. Then, on August 27th, an FBI analyst named Jennifer Walsh had been reviewing lawsuits filed against Titan in the previous 5 years. She'd found the Henderson case. She'd read about the contaminated water, the dead cattle, the settlement, the foreclosure. And she'd read that Robert Henderson had died of a heart attack during a deposition on February 18, 2003. She'd noted that Richard Blackwood, one of the first victims, had been the attorney conducting that deposition. Special Agent Torres had returned to the Henderson ranch on August 28th at 6:30 a.m. with a search warrant. Margaret had been awake, had been expecting this, had made coffee for the agents before they'd even asked. They'd searched the house for 6 hours. They'd found the notebook with the list of 14 names dated August 1st, 2003, hidden in a dresser drawer. They'd found the glass vial labeled flour in the sewing basket, still containing trace amounts of ricin. They'd found castor beans in the chicken coop, still drying. They'd found the receipt from the gardening supply company for 5 pounds of castor beans shipped to a P.O. box under the name Susan Miller. And they'd found in the basement Robert Henderson's reloading bench, and next to it a chemistry textbook from the Livingston Library with a bookmark on the page describing ricin extraction. Margaret Henderson had been arrested at 12:47 p.m. on August 28, 2003. The charge was 14 counts of first-degree murder. She'd been handcuffed, read her Miranda rights, placed in the back of a FBI vehicle. She'd asked if she could say goodbye to her son. They'd allowed it. John Henderson had been working in the barn, had come running when he saw the FBI vehicles, had stood in the driveway as his mother was led away. Margaret had looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, John. I couldn't let them get away with killing your father. The ranch is yours now. Don't let them take it." And then she'd been driven away to the Park County Jail, and later that evening, transferred to federal custody in Billings. The confession came immediately. Margaret Henderson had waived her right to an attorney, had asked to speak to investigators, had told them everything. She'd planned the killings for 3 weeks. She'd extracted the ricin herself. She'd contaminated the food. She'd watched them eat it. She'd known they would die, and she'd do it again. When asked why, she'd said, "They killed my husband. They stole our ranch. They poisoned our water and let our cattle die. I went to the courts. I went to the government. I followed every rule, and they all protected Titan. The law failed me, so I made my own justice." When asked if she felt remorse, she'd said, "I feel sorry for their wives. I feel sorry for their children. I know what it's like to lose someone. But those 14 men? No, I don't feel sorry for them. They made choices. They chose profits over people. They chose to destroy us, and choices have consequences." The trial of Margaret Henderson began on June 14, 2004, in U.S. District Court in Billings, Montana. Federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Patterson, sought the death penalty on all 14 counts of first-degree murder, plus charges of bioterrorism, use of a weapon of mass destruction, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret had confessed. The physical evidence matched her confession perfectly. The prosecution's case took 3 days to present. The defense, led by a team of attorneys from the Montana Innocence Project who'd taken the case pro bono after being contacted by ranching advocacy groups, didn't dispute the facts. Margaret had killed 14 people. That was not in question. The question was whether she deserved to die for it. The defense strategy was mitigation, not innocence. They argued that Margaret Henderson had been driven to an extreme act by extreme circumstances. They presented evidence of Titan AgriCorp's systematic destruction of the Henderson ranch, the contaminated water, the dead cattle, the legal warfare designed to bankrupt the family. They showed the jury photos of the 340 head of cattle that had died, bloated and suffering. They played video testimony from Dr. Biot. Patricia Morrison, the veterinarian, describing the contamination and the DEQ's refusal to act. They called Robert Henderson's cardiologist, who testified that stress from the lawsuit had been a contributing factor in his heart attack. They called environmental experts who testified about corporate tactics used to drive small operators out of business. They called economists who testified about the consolidation of American agriculture and the destruction of family farms. They called character witnesses who described Margaret as a hard-working, church-going woman who'd never been in trouble, who'd raised 2 children, who'd been a pillar of her community. The prosecution countered that personal tragedy doesn't justify mass murder, that 14 men had been killed, most of whom had families, children, lives, that even if Titan AgriCorp had acted unethically, that didn't give Margaret Henderson the right to execute its employees, that she'd used a weapon of mass destruction, ricin, that could have killed innocent people if her aim had been less precise, that she'd planned the killings methodically over 3 weeks, showing clear premeditation and absence of any heat of passion defense, that she'd shown no remorse, that she'd said she'd do it again, that she represented a danger to society and deserved the ultimate punishment. The jury, composed of 8 ranchers, 2 teachers, 1 nurse, and 1 retired postal worker, deliberated for 6 days. On June 29, 2004, they returned with verdicts: guilty of first-degree murder on all 14 counts, guilty of bioterrorism, guilty of use of a weapon of mass destruction. But in the sentencing phase, they deadlocked 11-1 on the death penalty. Federal law requires unanimity for execution. One juror, a rancher named Thomas Miller from Red Lodge, had refused to vote for death. He told the other jurors, "What she did was wrong, but what they did to her was wrong too. And I can't send a 59-year-old grandmother to death row for fighting back against a system that destroyed her family." The judge, Honorable Patricia Crawford, sentenced Margaret Henderson on July 15, 2004, to 14 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus 25 years for the bioterrorism charge, plus 30 years for the WMD charge. Margaret would die in federal prison. She would never see her ranch again, never hold her grandchildren again, never be free, but she wouldn't be executed. And when Judge Crawford asked if she had anything to say, Margaret Henderson had stood, had looked at the families of her victims sitting in the courtroom and had said, "I'm sorry for your losses. I know what it's like to lose someone you love, but your husbands, your fathers, they weren't innocent men. They destroyed my family for profit. They killed my husband as surely as if they'd shot him. And when I went to the law for help, the law protected them instead of me. I did what I had to do, and if faced with the same choice again, I'd make the same decision." Margaret Henderson was sent to FMC Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, the federal medical center for female inmates. She was 59 years old when she entered prison. She would be 73 before she'd even completed one of her 14 life sentences. She was assigned to Unit 2B, Cell 147, a 6-8-foot space with a metal bed, a toilet, a sink, and a small window that looked out at a concrete wall. She was processed, given a prisoner number, 47283-019, and told the rules. She would work in the prison laundry for 12 cents an hour. She would eat in the cafeteria at assigned times. She would have 1 hour of recreation time per day. She would be allowed visitors once a month for 2 hours. She would receive mail censored by prison officials. She would live this way until she died. In prison, Margaret Henderson became something unexpected. She became a cause. Ranching advocacy groups, family farm organizations, anti-corporate activists all rallied around her case. A website was created, freemargarethenderson.com, that detailed Titan AgriCorp's practices, the contamination of the Henderson Ranch, the legal warfare that had killed Robert. Petitions were circulated calling for her sentence to be commuted. Country singer Willie Nelson recorded a song called "The Widow's Justice" about her case. The case became a symbol, not of vigilante violence, but of corporate power unchecked, of a justice system that protected wealth over people, of the destruction of rural America. The families of the 14 victims reacted with predictable outrage. Richard Blackwood's widow, Catherine, gave interviews calling Margaret a terrorist who'd murdered her husband in cold blood. Jonathan Graves's children created their own advocacy group, demanding that Margaret's sentence be changed to death. They argued that she'd killed 14 people in a premeditated attack and deserved the same fate she'd given their fathers. But other families were quieter. Michael Stevens' son, a lawyer himself, admitted in an off-the-record interview that his father had known the Henderson case was wrong, had expressed discomfort with Titan's tactics, but had been following orders from the board. Does that excuse what happened? No, but does it make you think about corporate responsibility? Yes. The Henderson Ranch was indeed auctioned on August 25, 2003, the same day as the original foreclosure date, 3 days after the murders. The timing was coincidental but felt symbolic. The auction was held on the courthouse steps in Livingston, as required by Montana law. The opening bid was $1. $1 million, far less than the ranch's value, because the property now carried the stigma of being connected to a mass murder. Titan AgriCorp, through a shell company called Mountain West Holdings LLC, bid $1.3 million, but they didn't win. A coalition of 17 small ranchers from Park County, calling themselves the Henderson Legacy Trust, pooled their resources and bid $1.6 million. They won. The ranch was divided among the trust members, with one provision: 120 acres, including the original homestead, and the family cemetery would be deeded to John Henderson in perpetuity. The coalition had saved the ranch not just for the Henderson family, but as a symbol that small ranchers could still fight back, still win, still exist. John Henderson, Margaret's son, lives on those 120 acres today. He's 58 years old as of 2024, still works as a ranch hand for the Henderson Legacy Trust, earns $42,000 a year plus housing, and raises his grandchildren, Emma's 2 daughters, in the original log homestead built in 1887. He visits his mother once a month at FMC Carswell, a 2,100-mile round trip from Montana to Texas that takes him 3 days. He brings photos of the ranch, of the grandchildren, of the cattle. He tells her about the work, the weather, the neighbors. and he tells her that the ranch is still Henderson land, that Titan never got it, that she'd won in the end. Margaret listens, smiles, and says nothing about whether it was worth it. Sarah Henderson, Margaret's daughter, has distanced herself from the case. She changed her name to Sarah Chen in 2005, moved from Bozeman to Seattle, works as a librarian, and has never visited her mother in prison. She loves her mother, she says, but can't condone what she did. She explains to her daughters, Lily, now 26 and Grace, now 24, that their grandmother was a good person who did a terrible thing, and that life is more complicated than heroes and villains. Sarah sends letters twice a year, on Margaret's birthday and Christmas, but they're short, impersonal, the kind of letters you write out of obligation rather than connection. Titan AgriCorp faced significant consequences from the killings. The FBI investigation revealed extensive evidence of corporate malfeasance, the deliberate contamination of the Henderson water supply, bribes paid to Montana DEQ Inspector William Carter, falsified environmental reports, legal tactics designed to bankrupt opponents rather than seek justice. Criminal charges were filed against the corporation in 2005, resulting in a settlement of $47 million in fines and $180 million in victim compensation to be distributed among 73 ranching families who'd been harmed by similar tactics across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. The company was placed under federal monitoring for 5 years. Several board members resigned. The stock price dropped 34% in the 6 months following the killings, but Titan AgriCorp still exists. It's still the largest agricultural conglomerate in the Northern Rockies. It still owns 340,000 acres across 4 states. It still operates feedlots, still consolidates small ranches, still uses legal tactics that smaller operators can't match. The company's annual revenue in 2023 was $1.2 billion, 35% higher than in 2003. They've rebranded, cleaned up their public image, hired PR firms to emphasize sustainability and family values. But the fundamental business model hasn't changed. Buy land cheap, consolidate operations, maximize profit. The 14 executives that Margaret Henderson killed were replaced within 3 months. The company didn't even pause operations. The Montana State Legislature passed the Henderson Family Farm Protection Act in 2005, which strengthened water quality regulations, required independent environmental monitoring of large feedlot operations, and provided legal aid funding for small ranchers facing corporate litigation. Whether this law actually protects family ranches or just makes the destruction more bureaucratic, opinions vary. Some ranchers say it's made a difference. Others say corporations just hire better lawyers and find new loopholes. In popular culture, Margaret Henderson has become a folk hero in some circles and a monster in others. A documentary called The Widow's War was released in 2008, presenting a sympathetic portrait that won awards at film festivals and infuriated victim families. A book called Rice and Justice was published in 2010, arguing that Margaret was a terrorist who'd used the same weapon favored by Al-Qaeda and deserved no sympathy. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either portrayal. 2 television movies were made, one in 2012 and one in 2019, both heavily fictionalized, both portraying Margaret as either a hero or villain depending on the network's political leanings. Margaret Henderson herself, from prison, wrote letters to producers asking them to stop, saying she didn't want to be a symbol, didn't want attention, just wanted to be left alone to serve her sentence. They ignored her. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the CDC epidemiologist who'd identified the ricin, wrote a paper in 2006 about the case for the Journal of Bioterrorism and Biosecurity. She noted that Margaret Henderson had executed the most successful ricin attack in American history. Previous attempts, including the famous 1978 assassination of Georgy Markov in London, had killed 1 person. Margaret had killed 14. She'd extracted the toxin herself using information available in public libraries. She'd delivered it with precision in a crowded venue, and she'd almost gotten away with it. Would have if the victims hadn't all been connected to one company, making the pattern visible. Dr. Mitchell's conclusion was chilling. If Henderson had targeted random individuals rather than a specific group, the deaths would likely never have been connected, and the killer never identified. This case demonstrates that ricin, despite being classified as a WMD, can be produced and weaponized by a single individual with no special training, using easily obtained materials. The question that haunts Montana, that divides ranching communities to this day, is simple and impossible. Was Margaret Henderson right? Did those 14 men deserve to die? They'd destroyed her ranch, killed her husband, operated a system designed to crush people like her. but they'd also been human beings, husbands, fathers, people with lives and families who loved them. Some had directly harmed the Hendersons, Blackwood questioning Robert, Reinhardt calling the loan. Others had been peripherally involved, board members who'd voted on policies, consultants who'd written reports, judges who'd ruled on motions. Were they all equally guilty? Did they all deserve the same punishment? Richard Blackwood's widow, Catherine, has said, "My husband was just doing his job. He was an attorney representing a client. That's what attorneys do. He didn't kill Robert Henderson. He asked questions in a deposition. If that's a crime worthy of death, then every lawyer in America should be executed." But rancher advocacy groups counter. Richard Blackwood knew exactly what he was doing. He was part of a legal strategy designed to destroy the Hendersons economically and psychologically. He questioned a 64-year-old man with heart disease for 6 hours straight, pushing until Robert collapsed. That's not legal advocacy. That's torture. And he did it for $380,000 a year plus bonuses. Thomas Reinhardt, the bank president who called the Henderson loan, was 51 years old when he died. He had 3 children, aged 18, 15, and 12. His son Michael, now 36, has written about his father's death. "My dad wasn't a monster. He was a banker who made a business decision based on the ranch's financial situation. Was it harsh? Yes. Was it wrong? Maybe. Did it justify murder? Absolutely not. Margaret Henderson didn't just kill my father. She killed a youth soccer coach, a church deacon, a man who volunteered at the food bank. She killed the man who taught me to fish, to camp, to be a good person. And now I have to live with people telling me he deserved it." But John Henderson counters. Thomas Reinhardt sat on the board of a Titan subsidiary. He knew Titan was deliberately destroying us. He knew they'd contaminated our water. He knew the foreclosure was designed to force us out so Titan could buy the land. He wasn't an innocent banker making a tough call. He was part of a coordinated strategy to steal our ranch. My mother killed him. I don't celebrate that, but I understand it. The line between justice and revenge, between righteous anger and murder, is so thin it's invisible. Justice is the word we use when society sanctions the killing. Revenge is the word we use when individuals take justice into their own hands. Margaret Henderson crossed that line deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing, and she's paying for it with the rest of her life. But she crossed that line because every legal avenue had been closed, because the system had protected the powerful instead of the just, because her husband was dead and her ranch was being stolen and no one would help her. The uncomfortable truth that ranching communities whisper but don't say aloud is that sometimes people understand Margaret Henderson, even if they can't condone her. Because in rural America, where corporate consolidation is destroying small operations, where family ranches that have existed for generations are being bought out or forced out, where the law seems to protect only those who can afford lawyers, the question isn't whether Margaret was right or wrong. The question is, what would you do in her position? If your spouse died because corporations played legal games with their health? If your family's legacy was being stolen by people who saw it only as a line item on a balance sheet? If you went to the police, the courts, the government, and they all said, "Sorry, that's just business"? If you had to choose between accepting that power makes right or proving that there are still consequences in this world, what would you do? Margaret Henderson answered that question with 14 doses of ricin, administered over 48 hours. She answered it by sacrificing her freedom, her future, her relationship with her grandchildren. She answered it by becoming a killer to stop thieves, by becoming a villain to fight corruption, by crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. And the question she leaves us with isn't whether she was a hero or a monster. The question is whether we'd have the courage or the desperation or the fury to make the same choice. Whether we'd trade our lives for a statement, a message, a demonstration that some people still believe in consequences, even when the law doesn't provide them. 21 years have passed since that August, when a 58-year-old widow declared war on the most powerful agricultural corporation in Montana. The land where the Henderson Ranch once operated is now divided among 17 families, all small ranchers, all struggling to survive in an economy that favors consolidation over independence. The original log homestead where Samuel Henderson built his life in 1887 still stands, occupied by his great-great-grandson John and his great-great-great-granddaughters. The family cemetery where Robert Henderson is buried has been maintained, the headstone replaced with one that reads, "Robert James Henderson, 1939-2003, beloved husband, father, rancher, killed by men who valued profit over life." The Yellowstone Lodge in Gardner, Montana, where the gala dinner was held, still operates. The banquet hall has been renovated. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate that 14 people consumed their last meal there on August 22, 2003. The lodge management doesn't advertise the connection. In the storage closet where Margaret Henderson hid at 2 a.m. before accessing the kitchen, maintenance supplies are stored. No one remembers that history happened there. And Margaret Rose Henderson, 79 years old as of 2024, sits in cell 147 at FMC Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, serving the 21st year of 14 consecutive life sentences. She works in the laundry, earns 12 cents an hour, and has been a model prisoner. She's never filed an appeal, never requested commutation, never asked for mercy. When asked by a journalist in 2018 if she regretted her actions, she said, "I regret that those men had wives and children who loved them. I regret that my son has to visit me in prison instead of working the ranch with me. I regret that my grandchildren will know me only through letters and monthly visits. But do I regret stopping Titan AgriCorp from stealing our land? Do I regret avenging my husband? No. They started a war. I finished it." The question Margaret Henderson leaves us with, the question that Montana ranchers debate and corporate executives fear and families struggle with, is not about her guilt. She's guilty. She planned and executed 14 murders. By any legal standard, by any moral framework, she's a killer. But the question is about the system that created her, about a legal structure that allows corporations to destroy families with impunity, about courts that favor those who can afford better lawyers, about government agencies that are supposed to protect citizens, but instead protect corporate interests, about what happens when every legal option fails and the only justice available is the kind you take for yourself. If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price of fighting back against power, leave your like so others can find it. Share this video with someone who understands that real stories don't have heroes or villains, only people making impossible choices in impossible situations. Comment what you think. Was Margaret Henderson a hero or a murderer? Did those 14 men deserve to die? Is there a point where fighting back becomes justice rather than murder? There's no correct answer, and that's precisely the conversation we need to have. Subscribe for more real stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far we'd go to protect what we love. Because these stories aren't just from the past. Right now, somewhere in America, another family ranch is being destroyed by corporate consolidation. Another widow is burying a spouse killed by stress from fighting an unwinnable legal battle. Another person is facing the choice Margaret Henderson faced: submit to injustice or fight back knowing it will destroy you. And if you ever find yourself in Margaret Henderson's position, if the system fails you, if you have to decide between accepting that the powerful always win or proving that they don't, remember this: revenge has a price that's paid for the rest of your life. Justice might feel righteous in the moment, but it doesn't bring back the dead. And sometimes the price of fighting monsters is becoming one yourself. The Henderson Ranch survives. The 14 men are dead. The widow who killed them is dying in prison, will die there, has accepted that this is her fate. The corporation still operates, still consolidates, still destroys. The system that failed the Hendersons continues to fail others. And the question remains, unanswered, uncomfortable, unavoidable. What would you have done?